When self-made millionaire Jack Turner bought an old warehouse to expand his booming fashion brand, he expected dust, rust, and forgotten furniture. What he didn't expect were two fragile girls, barely 10, hunched over sewing machines, their tiny fingers trembling with fatigue. The air was thick with silence and suffering. Jack froze. In that instant, the world he'd built on ambition collided with a brutal hidden reality. What he did next would shake an entire industry and redefine the true cost of success. This isn't just a story, it's a reckoning. Jack Turner had always been a man with vision. From a modest apartment in Detroit to the polished boardrooms of New York City, he'd clawed his way up brick by brick, ambition by ambition. His clothing line, True North Apparel, had exploded onto the fashion scene just 6 years ago, blending sleek urban design with affordability. What began with a few sketchbooks and a garage full of fabric had turned into a multi-million-dollar brand with stores coast to coast. But Jack wasn't the kind of man to rest on success. Growth wasn't just a business strategy to him, it was survival. He knew the fashion world moved fast, and if you stood still for too long, you became irrelevant. So when the opportunity came to purchase a large, aging warehouse on the outskirts of the city at a rock-bottom price, Jack didn't hesitate. The warehouse had once belonged to an old textile company that shut down years ago. Since then, it had sat in silence, forgotten by the city, dismissed by developers, but ripe with potential in Jack's eyes. The location was perfect, close to shipping routes, near the labor market, and big enough to double as a manufacturing and distribution center. It was, on paper, the deal of the year. Jack's team had done the basic inspections, structurally sound, minor electrical work needed, nothing out of the ordinary. The paperwork went through in less than 2 weeks, and Jack signed the dotted line with the confidence of a man who believed he had seen it all. What Jack didn't know, what none of the inspectors or legal teams discovered, was that the warehouse hadn't been entirely abandoned. Somewhere beyond the rusted beams and broken windows, behind a hidden door no one thought to check, something darker had taken root. But on the surface, it was just another win for Jack Turner. Another step in the empire he was building. He held a quiet celebration that night. Just a few close friends and his COO, Jenna. Glasses clinked over cocktails as they talked about plans to renovate, to rebrand, to make it a cornerstone of True North's growing legacy. "I want local labor," Jack had said, leaning over the marble counter in his penthouse kitchen. "Oh, no more overseas headaches, no more shipping delays, we bring it all home. It's time we controlled every part of the process." Jenna nodded. "It's smart, sustainable, good for PR too." Jack grinned. "Exactly, everyone wins." But not everyone was winning. While Jack toasted to the future, two little girls were working through the night inside that very warehouse. Their fingers stitched without pause. Their backs ached. Their eyes fluttered with exhaustion they weren't allowed to acknowledge. For them, there was no vision of a future, no celebration, no freedom, just thread, needles, and silence. Back at the penthouse, Jack stood on his balcony, watching the lights of the city flicker. He thought of his past, the nights he'd slept. In his car, the months he'd gone without heating, just to save enough for his first production run. He remembered hunger, he remembered exhaustion, and he remembered the promise he made to himself the day True North broke its first million in revenue. "I'll never forget where I came from," he had whispered to his reflection, "and I'll never step on anyone to get ahead." He believed he'd kept that promise. The warehouse was supposed to be the next big move, the ethical all-American evolution of his brand, a symbol of control, growth, and good business. But by the time Jack would step foot into that building, only days later, everything he thought he knew about his company and himself would begin to unravel, because behind one locked door, hidden in the shadows of his newest asset, a truth waited, one that would stop him cold and demand a choice: look away or confront the ugly secret beneath his success. Just 3 days after closing the warehouse deal, Jack Turner found himself staring out the tinted window of his black SUV, watching the gray industrial skyline blur past. He wasn't supposed to be here. Not yet. His team had scheduled a full inspection and walkthrough for the following week, complete with engineers, designers, and contractors. But Jack had never been one to wait around for someone else to tell him what he already knew. If you want something done right, you do it yourself. This place is practically falling apart. Jenna had warned him that morning over coffee when he mentioned his change of plans. "What do you expect to find?" Jack shrugged. "Truth, maybe. Atmosphere. I want to feel the space before we gut it. Understand what we're working with." In truth, Jack had always trusted instinct over spreadsheets. Numbers told him what something was. His gut told him what it could. B. The SUV rolled to a stop in front of the warehouse. Towering, rusted, and silent, the afternoon sun cast long shadows across the lot, revealing weeds growing through cracks in the concrete and old graffiti faded by time. It was a place forgotten by the city and overlooked by progress. But Jack saw through it. He stepped out of the car, boots crunching on gravel, and motioned for his assistant Caleb to follow. The wind stirred bits of paper across the lot as they approached the heavy front doors. Jack tugged on the iron handle, stiff with years of neglect, and forced it open with a groan that echoed into the vast emptiness beyond. Inside, the air was dry and stale, carrying a faint scent of dust, rust, and something else. Something faintly metallic. The interior was dim, lit only by the shafts of sunlight slipping through high, broken windows. The space stretched endlessly, rows of forgotten shelving, abandoned crates, and machinery that hadn't moved in years. Jack inhaled deeply. "This is it," he said, voice low but certain. "This is where we build the future." Caleb hesitated. "You sure you want to walk through the whole thing alone? Place gives me the creeps." Jack smiled faintly. Fear's just potential waiting to be unlocked. He grabbed a flashlight from his coat pocket and moved deeper into the warehouse. The beam sliced through the gloom, bouncing off rusted metal and broken glass. The deeper he walked, the quieter the air became, as if even the building was holding its breath. He moved from section to section, mentally mapping possibilities. Offices could go here, a break room there. This area had the perfect flow for an assembly line. His mind was racing with possibilities when something odd caught his eye. A staircase, metal and narrow, tucked behind a collapsed partition wall. Jack frowned. That hadn't been in the floor plans. Curious, he made his way over and slowly ascended the creaking steps. At the top, a narrow corridor stretched into darkness, lined with small rooms, storage, or maybe offices. One door stood out. It was steel, newer than the others, with a padlock hanging loose. Jack stopped. The lock was open. Why would anyone leave that unsecured in an abandoned building? He reached for the handle, hesitated for a split second, then turned it slowly. The door opened with a soft metallic sigh. What he saw made his blood run cold. The room was dimly lit by a single flickering bulb, and in its weak glow, two small figures sat hunched over sewing machines. Children, girls, no older than 10 or 11. Their thin arms moved mechanically, threading and stitching fabric with the robotic precision of someone who had done it far too many times. They didn't see him at first. Jack couldn't move. His mind couldn't process what his eyes were screaming. Then one of the girls looked up, her eyes locked with his, wide, frightened, hollow. She flinched, instinctively shielding the fabric in her lap as if she expected punishment. That was when Jack heard the noise, footsteps behind him. He turned just in time to see a man emerging from the shadows at the far end of the corridor, his face twisted in surprise and anger. Jack stepped back, words caught in his throat. "What is this?" he demanded, his voice low, hoarse, shaking. The man said nothing, just froze, then turned and ran. Jack didn't follow. He turned back to the girls, heart pounding, the enormity of what he had just stumbled into crashing down on him. This wasn't just an abandoned warehouse. This was a crime. Scene. 6 months later, the warehouse looked nothing like it had before. Gone were the rusted walls, the shattered glass, the filth, and the shadows. In its place stood a modern sunlit facility with open floors, green spaces, safety signage, and a single bronze plaque near the entrance that read, "To those who were hidden, and to those who refused to look away." Jack Turner stood beneath it on a crisp fall morning, quietly watching a group of newly hired workers enter the building. Most of them were local. Many were single parents, immigrants, or survivors of exploitation. For some, this was their first legal job. For others, it was their first chance to feel safe while earning a wage. None of them knew what Jack had seen that day. They didn't know about the girls. They didn't know about the underground human trafficking ring that had used the warehouse as a front for years, exploiting children smuggled through back doors, invisible to society. Jack had reported everything, anonymously at first, but when the authorities made arrests and headlines followed, his name inevitably became attached. He could have denied involvement. He could have distanced True North from the scandal, but he didn't. Instead, he went public. He stood on national television beside the FBI and child advocacy groups and confessed what he'd seen. Not because he was guilty, but because silence would have made him complicit. "I built a company thinking I understood hard work," he said in an emotional interview on 60 Minutes. "But I didn't understand pain. Not like that. Not the kind you have to be forced into." His honesty made waves. Some investors panicked. A few stores boycotted his products. But for every backlash, there were 10 more who stood with him. Survivors, whistleblowers, workers, parents, even lawmakers. Jack launched a new foundation weeks later, the Unseen Project, aimed at identifying, rescuing, and supporting victims of forced labor hidden within U.S. supply chains. He hired investigative teams. He partnered with shelters and trauma counselors. He even worked with legislation advocates to draft stricter workplace inspection laws and funding for trafficking enforcement units. But none of it erased that day, or the eyes of the girl who had looked up from her sewing machine, terrified and exhausted. He didn't even know her name. The children were taken into state custody, and though Jack tried everything he could to get updates, the details were sealed to protect them. Occasionally, he would receive a vague report, doing well or placed with a family, but nothing more. Still, he kept going. The warehouse became more than just a production hub. It became a symbol of recovery. Inside, murals of hope and empowerment lined the walls. The break rooms included childcare areas for workers with kids. Every employee received training on labor rights, safety, and how to recognize signs of coercion. Jack knew he couldn't change the past, but he could make sure his company's future never repeated it. He was no longer just a businessman. He had become something more, a steward of justice, however reluctant. As he walked through the facility that morning, he paused near the east wing, where a classroom had been built into the office section. Inside, a volunteer was teaching English and basic math to a small group of women, new hires who were getting their GEDs while working part-time. One woman looked up and smiled at Jack. He smiled back, hand resting briefly on the glass. This was what growth looked like now. Not profit margins, not acquisition deals, but impact. He exited through the rear doors and stood at the edge of the parking lot where a community garden was blooming, planted by the workers themselves. Tomatoes, mint, bell peppers, and herbs lined the beds. Jenna approached from the lot. "They want you inside for the press photos." Jack nodded slowly. "In a minute." He looked back at the warehouse, his warehouse, and thought about the journey that had brought him here. Not just the business decisions, but the moral reckoning. The moment where everything paused, where he froze in the doorway and had to choose who he wanted to be. He chose truth, and that choice rewrote everything. Tools?